Hello and thank you for joining us on Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Paris Schutz has the evening off. Here's what we're looking at.
Number one, your money comes from Springfield.
Attorneys make their closing arguments in the massive ComEd 4 corruption trial. Why some states are rolling back child labor laws. An ethics violation for a prominent supporter of Mayor Lightfoot.
My husband, he's like, we need you. Don't stop.
And people spend years waiting for an organ donation, how revamping the transplant waiting list could help those in need. But now to some of today's top stories. An arson investigation is underway at a residence in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood. Officials say the fire broke out late last night after an object was ignited and thrown at the home. A 4-year-old and a 9-year-old were sent to the hospital for smoke inhalation. Police say the 4-year-old is in critical condition. This comes as firefighters today pass out smoke detectors to neighbors following yesterday's deadly house fire in Dunning on Chicago's northwest side. Officials say 78-year-old Francine Machitelli was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of the fire is still under investigation. The book Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe is the most challenged book in the U.S. for the second year in a row. That's according to the Chicago-based American Library Association, which released its list of the top 10 most challenged books of 2022. The association found a nearly 40% increase in the number of titles challenged for censorship last year. It also found most of the targeted books were written by or about members of the LGBTQ+ community and people of color. The executive director of the American Library Association, Tracy Hall, just joined us on our Chicago Tonight Black Voices program over the weekend. You can see that conversation on our website. Senator Dick Durbin is calling for more protections for letter carriers following an increase in armed robberies.
The victims here are not just the letter carriers. They're the families that count on the delivery of mail for their daily lives. As I mentioned, Social Security checks and prescription drugs.
Senator Durbin says letter carriers are being targeted for their master keys, which thieves can use to access mailboxes. He's calling on the Postmaster General and Department of Justice to implement a strategy to protect letter carriers and prioritize the prosecution of those committing crimes. And Chicago now has its first ever Poet Laureate. Avery R. Young will serve 2 years as Chicago Poet Laureate, commissioning poems and creating public programming. He will also be an ambassador for the city's literary and creative communities. Young is an award-winning poet, educator, and multidisciplinary artist. He's also the co-director of the art collective Floating Museum. Up next in the program, liars and bribers are just really good lobbyists. Closing arguments began in the ComEd bribery trial. Amanda Vinicky with that story next.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
It's been about 6 weeks of recorded phone calls and meetings and testimony about the interactions between one of Illinois' most powerful companies and one of Illinois' most powerful politicians. How jurors view it could come down to what happened in court today and what happens tomorrow, as all of the action is distilled in closing arguments. Amanda Vinicky was at the federal courthouse today and joins us now. Amanda, what happened?
Brandis, well, jurors' task is to determine whether the defendants, collectively known as the ComEd 4, were part of a conspiracy to bribe Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan in exchange for jobs and favors for his allies. It isn't hyperbole to say that so much comes down to these next couple days. What's said in closing arguments will be freshest in jurors' minds, and they've likely cut a lot on their minds. It's been a lengthy trial with 4 defendants covering complex ground: politics, parliamentary procedure, plus facets of nuclear energy and the electric grid. Prosecutors say it's simple enough, though, that the defendants are a close-knit group of conspirators who plotted to give a, quote, continuous stream of benefits to corruptly influence and reward Madigan. As the assistant U.S. attorney repeated, As if to drill home the point, it was a cycle of Madigan wanted, ComEd gave, and ComEd got. When Madigan said jump, she said, the defendants asked, how high? Or, she half-joked, in the case of ComEd hiring paid interns from Madigan's ward who had GPAs below the company's cutoff, how low? The jury once again said how lucrative this could all be for some of Madigan's recommended hires. Here's a video of defendant Jay Doherty, who put the hires on his lobbying firm's payroll.
And this is just you and me talking. I don't even know who else knows this. John Hooker called. He said, "Jay, I got a sub for you. A
subcontractor.
Olivo. Frank
Okay.
Olivo." He said, we're going to pay him every month.
You saw at the end how Doherty held up 4 fingers, as in $4,000 a month. Prosecutors say that's one of many indications that it was a scheme, that this inner circle intentionally kept private, that he didn't say that 4K out loud. And the man who was referenced, former alderman of Madigan's 13th ward, Frank Olivo, was paid $368,000 from 2011 until mid-2019 for little or no work. One of several such subcontractors. A point that, again, prosecutors drilled to jurors by replaying more of the clandestine video.
All these guys do is, they're a sub under you and you cut them a check. Do they do anything, or what do they do? What do you have them doing?
Not much. To
Okay.
answer the question.
Okay.
Not much.
Now, we can't show it because no photos, copies of slideshows, no recordings from court allowed, but the assistant U.S. attorney showed the jury a timeline of when folks recommended by Madigan got contracts with ComEd, and then when legislation lucrative to ComEd and its parent company Exelon passed. Sometimes it was right before a bill passed, in which case the job was allegedly meant to influence Madigan. Other times it was right after. Then it was a reward. The prosecution's point, the hires weren't just for goodwill or for skill. It was part of an attempt to corruptly influence an elected official. They also said that the 2 defendants who testified during the trial, former ComEd CEO Ann Pramaggiore and lobbyist John Hooker, lied on the stand as cover. For example, Pramaggiore said she didn't know about the subcontractors and their Madigan connections until the investigation was public in 2019. The U.S. Attorney's Office played tape of a call from a year earlier. They say that proves that that is a lie.
And Amanda, has the defense gotten a chance to respond to all this?
They are getting started with that, Brandis. Today, the lawyers representing Pramaggiore, as well as lobbyist and Madigan close pal Michael McLean, made their closing cases. McLean's attorney didn't play any tapes or videos or combat any particular lines from them. Rather, he argued that while jurors may not like what they heard, or really they may not like anything about politics and lobbying, that it was all above board. Most of it, he says, was evidence that McLean was really good at lobbying, and that McLean and the other defendants weren't so great at committing a conspiracy that he says never existed. He says the prosecution failed utterly in their attempt to prove one, and that they offered no witnesses, no evidence that Madigan took action to help ComEd with legislation. Despite the jobs, the defense argues, no one from the group ever even asked Madigan for such a favor, and that for all of the hubbub about those job recommendations, there was nothing suspicious about it, that this was a regular occurrence at ComEd. Now, as for Pramaggiore, her attorney also says Madigan was never a friend to ComEd, rather that his client said flattering things on repeated calls because she's nice and because she was a successful CEO, which he says also is not a crime. Her attorney says the hires she made were for real jobs, and that makes them legal. Now, Brandis, attorneys for Doherty and for Hooker, they get their turn tomorrow, and then the government has one final say before this goes to the jury. Meanwhile, as Cranes reported, ComEd is now asking state regulators for a hike in electric rates, and that is connected to one of the bills that's at the heart of this case.
And of course, a lot for jurors to consider when the case does go to them. We'll have more on that when it comes down, of course. Amanda, thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, some states are considering a bill to loosen child labor laws. We share details right after this. 14 and 15-year-old children in Iowa could be allowed to work night shifts and assembly lines if a bill passes the state's legislature. And workers under the age of 16 in Arkansas won't have to prove their age or get work permits to go to work. It's part of a push in several states to loosen labor laws for children. Joining us now with more is Catherine Kafka-Waltz, director of the Center for Human Rights of Children at Loyola University Chicago. Now, we've reached out to a number of organizations who have supported relaxing some of these child labor laws, but none were able to join us tonight. Catherine, we thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So a recent piece in the Washington Post found that one of those organizations, a conservative think tank, the Foundation for Government Accountability, is among those pushing for relaxed child labor laws nationwide. What has been their argument to do this, to loosen child workplace protections?
Well, I can speak to the different arguments of different organizations and some of the congressional representatives in different states. And their argument is that there's a gap in the labor force and that we need to fill that. And a good population to fill that would be young adults, adolescents, and children.
Would this legislation, conflict with federal labor laws, since right now it's sort of happening state by state?
It absolutely does conflict with federal labor laws. And in that sense, one of the, I think, reality checks of these state proposals to relax child labor laws is that because of the supremacy clause under the U.S. Constitution, that the federal laws, which are often more protective of child labor laws, there would be a conflict with federal law. And these state laws, if they did pass, would be under more scrutiny and likely under more potential legal challenges if they did pass. But that being said, it's still a very, I think, disturbing trend among several states to loosen these laws around child labor.
And I want to get into that in a bit as well, but because another thing that supporters say is that this is a parental rights issue. Parents should be able to decide whether or not their teenager works and when. What do you say to that argument?
You know, this isn't child labor as we think about it in terms of like babysitting and car washing. These are hazardous occupations that are in the industries that are pushing for these relaxations in child labor laws are not safe environments. So hazardous work environment is where there's a potential for harm, whether it's physical or mental. It's often associated with a condition of activity that, if left controlled, can result in injury or illness. So I think that is incredibly problematic when we're talking about this issue.
U.S. Labor Department says in fiscal year 2022, there were more than 3,800 children found to be working in violation of those federal child labor laws, and that's an increase over the last 5 years. Catherine, tell us a little bit more about what some of these jobs are, what they're like.
Well, it goes back to my earlier point. This is not tech, it's not finance, it's not babysitting, it's not car washing. It's often the least regulated industries in labor. It is meat packing, it's manufacturing, it's working in hazardous work conditions. So for example, the Packer Sanitation Services, which was fined $1.5 million for employing children as young as 13 who are working overnight shifts, engaged in work that expose them to hazardous chemicals and cleaning processing equipment. Some of those children experience chemical burns, other types of, again, hazardous and dangerous employment.
Why do you think there's been that increase in the last few years, Catherine?
I think probably there's two things that are happening. One is there is an increase in vulnerable young people, particularly migrant children, and there's been a lot of news around this, who may be engaged in this type of work. And I think the other piece is that there's more attention being drawn to the issue, so not necessarily it's happening at higher rates, but that there is more oversight. People are paying attention. I think about this as it intersects with my work on child labor trafficking and human trafficking and exploitation of children. I think because of the increased interest in preventing and identifying human trafficking cases, there's more interest in areas where children may be exploited for hazardous forms of labor.
Do you think some children end up involved in this work, like you said, exploited? Do they feel the need to earn an income to contribute to the income at home?
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent question. And I think this is kind of one of the nuances. I think it's really easy to say, well, no child should be working these. Some may argue that no child should be working in these conditions, and others, other industries and those who are trying to pass these laws say, well, children should have a choice or parents should have a choice. It's complex. In my work, when I work with children who are exploited, often they're doing so because they're working because they feel like they have to. They feel like they have to earn their keep as part of their survival in living or working with a family member, parents, guardians, extended family, or even just survival in this country, also if they're documented or undocumented.
We've got a few seconds left, about 30 seconds, Catherine. What's the likelihood of a similar law being proposed or passed in Illinois?
I think it's highly unlikely. Most of these laws that are being drafted and developed, none have passed yet, are by Republicans who are backed by industry. So I think it's very unlikely. I do think it's a troubling trend, though, that says a lot about how we value children in our society. And I'm not saying that children shouldn't work or learn skills, but I think children should prioritize attending school, being safe, being protected. And there's a tender balance that we need to really pay attention to in terms of children involved in hazardous work. And I certainly don't support bills that would allow for this to happen.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. Catherine Kafka-Waltz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A prominent business owner and Mayor Lightfoot supporter is fined for an ethics violation. Heather Sharon with that story right after this. A clout-rich businessman who gave thousands of dollars to Mayor Lori Lightfoot's campaign admitted to violating the city's ethics ordinance. He'll have to pay $5,000 to resolve the charges. WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. Heather, tell us a bit about Carmen Rossi.
Well, he owns a number of nightclubs and bars in Chicago. He also holds the liquor license for the Lollapalooza Music Festival. So he also won a contract back in 2022 to operate 13 parking garages and lots around Wrigley Field and the United Center so that people can park there to the benefit of the Chicago Public Schools, which owns that land. And that is where all of this problem started.
Okay, so what's he accused of doing?
So he needed business licenses to run those parking lots, which he didn't have. And there was some problem with him getting those licenses. So he reached out to Ken Meyer, who's the commissioner of the Business Affairs and Consumer Protection Department, and said, hey, can you help? That was an act of lobbying, the Chicago Board of Ethics decided. But Rossi, who was registered as a lobbyist for 4 other firms, was not registered as a lobbyist for his parking firm, and that violated the city's ethics ordinance.
Okay, so what prompted the ethics board to start investigating Rossi?
Well, we really have to tip our cap to the Chicago Sun-Times, which has done a number of stories about Carmen Rossi and his contributions to Mayor Lori Lightfoot, which seemed to run afoul of a 2011 executive order issued by former Mayor Rahm Emanuel that said lobbyists should not contribute directly to city officials or city candidates. Now, these contributions from Rossi came through his businesses. So the idea was that it didn't violate the letter of the executive order, but Mayor Lightfoot ended up returning most of the campaign contributions just because of those concerns.
Why does the ethics board track lobbyists?
Well, in Chicago, we have a long history of pay-to-play politics in Chicago, and a lot of times companies have sought to sort of cloak those donations through lobbyists, and that's why the Chicago Board of Ethics keeps a closed eye on who does the lobbying and what sort of campaign contributions they give.
A history of foul play in Chicago, Heather, never happens.
Shocking, I know, Brandon.
Heather Sharon, thanks so much. And you can read Heather's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. April is National Donate Life Month. According to the Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, nearly 43,000 transplants were done last year, a record number. Despite more people getting organs, it's still not enough to meet high demand. Recently, the U.S. government announced a plan to revamp the way organ recipients are chosen and organs are distributed. Joanna Hernandez joins us now with more. Joanna, who has been running the organ donation system?
Well, Brandis, the nonprofit United Network for Organ Sharing, known as UNOS, is currently the only organization contracted by the government to oversee the system. Now, it has faced criticism over its management of the massive and complex apparatus that allocates organs to patients. I donated my kidney to my brother 2 years ago, and thankfully we were a perfect match and were able to proceed with the transplant. However, that's not the case for the thousands of people on the waiting list.
Life hasn't been the same for Christine Hernandez for the last 7 years.
I basically stick myself here and here, or here and here. I could stick myself all along this way and all along this way to give myself dialysis. And this is like my life support.
Hernandez was a nurse before being diagnosed with a rare disease that has caused her kidneys to fail. She's been on the organ waiting list for 4 years.
Dialysis is something I have to do to stay alive, to be there another day, and then to pray, hope and pray that I get that transplant.
Recently, the federal government announced an initiative to revamp the waiting list and distribution. The United Network for Organ Sharing, or UNOS, has been the sole operator of the system since the 1980s.
The pros would be of trying to break it up a little bit is that, you'd be able to get groups that may be better suited for different tasks, so like organ allocation or optimization of quality improvement.
So how does the system work? A federal agency, HRSA, oversees UNOS. In turn, UNOS runs the nation's organ procurement and transplantation network, or OPTN. That's a complex system made of transplant hospitals and organ procurement organizations, or OPOs, a huge operation that matches donated organs with people who need them, a system doctors like Divya Jain depend on.
So let's say you have Hospital A, and Hospital A has a patient that has just passed, and that family would like to donate the patient's organs. So then the organ procurement organization for Hospital A, so we'll call that OPO, Organ Procurement Organization, OPOA. So Hospital A calls OPOA to let them know we have a patient who's passed and they would like their organs to be donated. They then notify the United Network of Organ Sharing, so UNOS. UNOS creates lists for these organs.
UNOS has been criticized over its management of the system. Last year, the Senate Finance Committee found the organization lost, discarded, or failed to collect thousands of organs. Illinois Congresswoman Robin Kelly recently introduced a bill that aims for the government's Health Resources and Services Administration to run a competitive process to choose multiple contractors to manage the transplant network, not just UNOS.
Clean that up and make sure, again, that the system is modernized, that it's run in an efficient manner, that the information that needs to be out there can be easily found. The success rates told, the wait times.
According to the HRSA, there's more than 100,000 people on the national transplant list. To break it down a little further, in Illinois, there's approximately 4,000 people on the waiting list. That means people like Hernandez may wait years before they get that life-saving phone call.
In the last 4 years, she's received 2 calls she says ended in disappointment.
The second one that they called, it was coming from like the West Coast. And it was unfortunate because it was actually a good match, but they wouldn't let the kidney get on the plane. Took them over here. So I was like, I got this close.
But the idea of splitting responsibility concerns Hernandez. In the meantime, Christine Hernandez waits.
I'm tired.
You're still fighting.
I'm still fighting.
The government's plan is to double funding for programming while updating technology, managing data, and improving operations. In a statement, UNO says it supports the plan to revamp the organ transplant system and welcomes competition into the mix. Brandis.
And of course, Joanna, it's amazing and impressive and important and special that you were able to make that kidney donation for your brother a couple of years ago. Thank you for the story.
Thank you.
Up next, a look at what's on tap for tomorrow, right after this. And that's our show for this Monday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 10. On the show, community members share what they want to see from their next police superintendent. Plus, a holistic approach to helping residents released from prison reintegrate into their communities. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that's proud to serve its community through pro bono legal services.